Right, hi, Siddiq here. Recently at SPS we had a couple of different approaches to image selection or selection of part of an image, particularly when it's a difficult image. Select it from the background using Photoshop, using topaz filters, and then of course there's various other ways of doing it. Now I'm using Affinity Photo here, and I'm not going to use a filter and a third-party filter. Affinity Photo has got a very good set of selection tools, much like Photoshop, but they do work slightly differently. So I want to demonstrate again an alternative method or process of selecting different parts of a foreground image from its background, depending on the complexity of that foreground. Okay, I've got three images here. This one, then this one where you've got lots of strands of fur or could be hair from a background, and then this one where you've got very small twigs and leaves and branches from the background of the sky. Okay, now they all pose slightly different challenges, so let's start with this first one. Okay, and really the only tool we're going to be using is the selection brush tool, and then its set of refine options at the top here. Okay, so you select the selection brush tool, and again with any tool, if you want to change the size of it, yes, you can use the size at the top here, but if you use the square bracket keys on your keyboard, left bracket smaller and right bracket larger, I tend to find that's a lot quicker, keeping my one hand on that and the other hand on the mouse. So at a suitable size, just start selecting. Don't worry about the accuracy exactly here, so do it roughly, so you're selecting most of the foreground. In this case it's trees and foliage. Don't worry about it in too much. Clearly that's not an ideal selection, so we're just going to zoom in a little bit, and you've got here the refine button. So as soon as you click on the refine button, what the program does, Affinity Photo, is that it gives you, if I just bring this up, it gives you a matte of the background compared to what you've selected, and clearly there are missed elements here which you want to fine tune. Now we're not going to mess with the border width and the smooth and the feathering and the ramp options at this stage. What we want to do is to just show you what's available, what's possible as in the initial settings. So what I want you to look at here is this is currently giving us a matte, so that red area is the bit that we want to isolate from the background. Then we've got foreground, background and feathering. We're not going to look at feathering just yet, but the foreground and background we will be looking at that. Okay, so essentially you've got the tool still selected, and what you do is you're refining the selection. So as you paint in small sections over the foreground, it will sample those pixels compared to the background and refine the selection. Now you might not be able to tell just yet, but once we zoom in, you'll be able to see that in fact this simple method does in fact refine the selection so well that you probably don't need to do anything else. Okay, but I will show you a couple of other methods as well. So you can start seeing now the red is coming through, and where it's still a little bit got that yellowish tinge, which means it hasn't quite selected it properly, you can go over it again. And of course, if you get it wrong, if it doesn't quite work, you can go back and undo it. Okay, so here we go. That's pretty much done it. So that fine tuning it, and to check that if it's done really well, what you can do is on the overlay, currently we're in overlay, which is the matte. If you it as a black matte, it makes the background that you're selecting from black. Well, that's obviously not enough contrast because the foreground's already dark. But if you did it as a white, that's much better contrast. So now we can see that the selection is very good. All those tiny twigs, look at those, the leaves all selected just with painting with the refined brush. And there's a little bit of area there, look, where I could paint over it, and it'll do another selection, and it'll, there we go, and that's improved it quite a lot. Once it's selected, just center it, just do Command and 0 or Control and 0 on a PC. You can, let's just go back to overlay so we're keeping consistent. At the bottom here, what do you want the output to be once you've done your selection? You can just do apply and it'll just do a selection, and then you can cut and paste it or make adjustments to that selection as you see fit. But one of the really good options here is if you say the output should be a new layer with mask, then click apply. Then in the layers palette on the right hand side in a moment, what you'll see is there's your original background. If you just show you that, put that back on, that's your original image. But what it's actually given us is a selection on a clear background. Okay, so it's actually given us a matte already ready to do whatever we want to do. And again, if we zoom into that, you can see all those individual twigs and leaves have been selected. Okay, so that's that particular image. Let's go on to the next image. This is a typical image that you'd be selecting of hair and fur on animals or people, so or Wookiees as the case may be. So again, I've got the selection brush tool again. When it's a large area initially, increase the size of the brush and do a very quick, and all I'm doing is I'm pushing the selection to the edges, and as you get to the edges, then reduce the size of the brush so that what you're doing is you're just fine-tuning it. Don't worry about the edges just yet. We'll get to those, and those strands of hairs we don't want to worry about. Okay, so that's a rough selection. You can see there are hairs out of the range which haven't been selected, but this is where the refine option comes in. So again, click on refine, and taking the size of the brush appropriately, first thing to do is to go around the edges, and it'll then fine-tune the edge of that selection. So just paint a small section at a time. This is very similar to other programs. And then over the top, and it'll, so you can see there it actually did a much better selection. Then there, then all the way down, say there, and then over that edge. Okay, and then what we're going to do is to just go over the strands as well. So decrease the size of the brush a little bit. So this will now select those strands as well. Now, once you zoom in, if it isn't quite right, you can click on foreground or background, and the foreground option allows you to just paint over the foreground, and it's basically telling it to prioritize that this is the foreground, not the background. And you don't need to go over it with a fine tooth comb, you just need to roughly tell it, as you can see here, there. So it means that you're not missing any of the foreground pixels, and it just fine tunes the edge. See there, here, so if I just paint it there, it'll tell you now that's not right. So that we go to background, reduce the size of the brush, and we're saying, what we're saying is that is the background. So it'll do another selection, and then it'll clean that matte up a little bit. Can you see that? Now we could just go back to matte again and refine the edge of that matte. That's better. So we're going skipping between matte, foreground and background to emphasize where we want to fine tune the edge, the matte, where we want to tell the program that this is definitely foreground material, where we want to tell the program this is definitely background material. So we go back to foreground, and we're telling it that's foreground, that's foreground, and down here that's foreground, and then it then removes those pixels which are actually telling it that it's the background. There we go. That's almost done now. So we'll just go over this bit here, telling it's the foreground. Now here, it hasn't quite selected the background, isolated the background. So we click on the background tab there in that dialog box, and we just fine tune it and set it that that's in fact the background. Now there's a hair there, I believe, so if we click on foreground and say, well actually I think that's part of the foreground, and if it doesn't quite work, just do that. Okay, now that's not ideal. That hair isn't significant enough to warrant isolating that. Okay, let's just center that again, and that selection's done. It's selected the hairs again. If you want to see it in a better isolated, do it against a white background, and now we can see all the individual hairs there, look, that you couldn't quite see there. And again, output either just as a selection or at least as a selection, or new layer with mask, or just a new layer. So if we in this case click on new layer, it will then create a new layer with that selection. Okay, so if we just that's it, that's our original, and then that's our selection layer. Okay, so let's go on to the third image, this one. Now this one, you might think that actually that's quite easy because it's angular lines, there's no hairs or feathers or difficult edges. It's a clear blue sky, the building's very easy to, it's very contrasty, it's very easy to isolate from the background. Yes, that's true, but here this clock is almost of the same color blue as the background, so that would pose problems, challenges. And you've got little cutouts in the little details, and of course in the steel that's holding that clock up, there's a sky in the background. So that's the challenging part. So initially doesn't look too difficult, but again we'll go through the steps. So on the left hand side you go to the selection brush tool, as I said, and we're selecting, you can either select the foreground or select the background. Okay, so we're going to select the foreground, of course, because that's what we did with the others, but you can select the background if you want to first, but I'm not going to do that. So again, we're selecting the foreground. Now it won't do it quite right here, but don't worry about that because we're going to fine tune it, aren't we? So if you reduce the size of the brush, it does tend to make it a bit more sensitive. So just do it roughly around the edge. We're going to fine tune it. You can zoom into it, make it a bit easier. And again, don't worry too much about the edges of that. Like I said, we're going to fine tune it. Okay, we're going to fine tune this area here as well. So that's the rough selection. Okay, once we've done that selection, we want to go to refine, same as before. I'll bring this dialog box over here this time, and we're going to fine tune that. So we want to change the size of the brush and say we want to find the overlay. So just changing the size of the brush. So again, go around the edges of your selection to make sure that it's selecting the edge, even though it probably did it pretty well. Okay, so then once you've selected it, and then we can just go around the edge there. Now it won't get that right first time. I know from experience that it won't, but you can certainly give it a go. See, it's actually not selected that very well at all. But what we can do is when we zoom in, if you tell it that that's the foreground, so click on foreground and just paint over the foreground, so make sure there's no pixels selected that shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a matte. Okay, so we're just going to, again, and the good thing about this particular tool is that you don't have to paint it accurately. You just need to be roughly to the edge, but not quite, and it picks up those pixels that it thinks are the foreground. Now we can now see a little bit of blue spill there, which you don't want. So what you want to go to now is background, and then literally just paint on the background and say what you're telling it is that is definitely the background, and you're not going right to the edge of the object. You're just outside the edge, and it will pick it up really well. Now when you look at it, you can see, okay, we can fine tune that, but it's certainly much better than it was before. See it now, it's hugging the side of that object. Okay, let's just center that again. Now we've got to eliminate these bits that we can see in the middle. Okay, so we've got to tell it that that is the background. Okay, so we've got background selected. Again, adjust the size of the brush. You don't need to paint it accurately. You've just got to roughly draw out the shape, and you'll see what happens. Okay, can you see that? So again, if you want to fine tune it, just zoom right in, reduce the size of the brush, and just paint it roughly, and there you go. So again, we'll do this one. The key here, like with all programs, is a bit of trial and error, but also reduce, increase the size of the brush, zoom in, so don't make it difficult for yourself, particularly if you have a large monitor. Zoom right in, and then you can really get an accuracy in the pixels. Okay, so what I want to do is to just do this last few, bring it down like this. There we go. That one's done. A couple more here. So though these are very tiny, so zoom right in, decrease the size of your brush accordingly, and then roughly draw. And remember, what we're telling the program is that is definitely the background. Okay, and it'll quite intelligently go right to the edge, and if it doesn't, then just paint a little bit to help it along, like that one. And that's of course without changing these parameters here, because by changing these parameters you can fine tune it even more, but we're not going to go into that here. That's something that you can explore and find out for yourselves. Okay, So what originally seemed like an easy selection, you can see that it's actually quite involved. Okay, so the last part really is this up here to make sure is that little architectural feature actually that's selected it quite well. I don't need to do anything there, I don't think. Let's just make sure. No, I think that's fine. But if that wasn't quite right, you could just go to say that's foreground and just paint there, and it'll just make sure that it has selected it, identified it as foreground. That is quite difficult, of course, because of the very small nature. It's at an angle, and it would have a difficulty in determining that that was foreground. Okay, again, if you want to see it, the background in contrast to the foreground, instead of using overlay here, do it as a white matte so that the background is white and the foreground is the original color. And you can see those cutouts in between. That steel support is perfect now. And then, of course, again, how do you want to output that selection? We can do it as a new layer with mask, or just mask. So let's just do just mask this time. Click apply, and of course you've got your original layer and you've got the mask already there, rating for you to obviously apply other effects or to isolate that foreground object and so on. So those are just 3 examples of 3 quite different images, quite complicated in their own way, to isolate a foreground object from its background. And of course, once you've isolated a foreground object, you can just reverse the selection or invert the selection, and that effectively then you've got the background selected. So it's the selecting part that we're looking at here. So this particular tool here, the selection brush tool, combined with the refine option, really is very, very very accurate and very effective in selecting parts of an image. I hope that's helpful and complementary to the 2 colleagues from Semitic Photographic Society that showed us the ways of doing the same thing but in Photoshop and with the Topaz set of filters. Okay, thank you.